It was always the skeptic in my family. Growing up, my grandmother would tell stories about the things she'd seen in the Bayou country where she was raised, creatures that walked on two legs but weren't human, shadows that moved against the wind, sounds in the swamp that didn't belong to any animal anyone could name. I'd listen politely and nod in the right places, but inside I was rolling my eyes. Gran was getting old, and old people remember things differently than they happened. That's what I told myself. Every grainy video of supposed cryptids, every breathless account of a Sasquatch sighting, every believer who swore up and down they'd seen something impossible, I dismissed them all. Attention seekers, hoaxers, people with overactive imaginations who'd seen a bear in poor lighting and convinced themselves it was something more. For 37 years, I held on to that comfortable skepticism like a security blanket. Then my own security cameras captured something that shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. That was 5 weeks ago, and I still haven't figured out how to process what I've seen. I'm sharing this now because the silence has become unbearable. I need to tell someone, even if that someone is just strangers on the internet who will probably think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have lost my mind, but if I haven't, then people need to know what's really out there in the wild places, watching us from the shadows, learning our habits, and sometimes deciding to get a closer look. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is where I live and what happened there. I own a small house in rural Vermont, about 15 miles outside of a town so tiny it barely registers on most maps. The property sits on nearly 3 acres, with the front portion being what you'd expect from a New England homestead, a modest lawn, a gravel driveway, a weathered barn I use for storage, and a covered porch where I spend most of my summer evenings. The back half of my property is different. It slopes down into dense forest that connects to thousands of acres of protected wilderness. The Green Mountains rise in the distance, their slopes covered in a mix of deciduous and evergreen trees that create an impenetrable wall of green during the warmer months. When the leaves fall, you can see deeper into the woods, but somehow that makes it feel even more vast and empty. All those bare branches stretching endlessly toward horizons you can never quite reach. I bought this place 8 years ago when my software consulting business finally started generating enough income that I could work from anywhere with decent internet. The isolation was the whole point. I'd spent my 20s and early 30s living in Boston, surrounded by noise and people and the constant pressure of urban life. When the opportunity came to escape all that, I took it without hesitation. The nearest neighbor is almost half a mile down the road. An elderly couple who keep to themselves and rarely venture out except to check their mailbox or tend to their chickens. The town itself has a general store, a post office, a volunteer fire department, and not much else. People move out here specifically because they don't want to be around other people. That suited me perfectly, or at least it did until recently. The strange occurrences started in late summer, around the end of August. Little things at first, so minor that I barely registered them as unusual. I'd go outside in the morning to check on my vegetable garden and find tools moved from where I'd left them the night before. Not dramatically displaced, just shifted a few feet, as if someone had picked them up to examine them and set them down in slightly different spots. I blamed my own absent-mindedness at first. I work long hours sometimes, staring at code until my eyes blur. And it wouldn't be the first time I'd forgotten exactly where I put something. But then the pattern became harder to ignore. A rake I was certain I'd left leaning against the barn would turn up lying flat in the grass 20 feet away. Gardening gloves would disappear from my potting bench and reappear days later on top of my woodpile. One morning, I found 3 of my hand tools arranged in a perfect row near the edge of the forest, lined up parallel to each other with exactly equal spacing between them. That wasn't absent-mindedness, that was something else. The garbage became another mystery. I keep my trash cans in a small enclosure behind the barn, protected from wind and animals by a wooden frame with a latching gate. The system had worked perfectly for years. Raccoons couldn't get in, bears couldn't knock the cans over, and everything stayed neat and contained until garbage day. Then suddenly, I started finding the enclosure open in the mornings and the cans disturbed. Not knocked over or torn apart like animal damage usually looks, but carefully opened. The lids would be removed and set aside, the contents examined and sometimes scattered, but nothing was actually eaten or taken. It was like something was going through my garbage looking for something specific and then leaving disappointed when it didn't find what it wanted. I added a padlock to the enclosure gate, one of those combination locks that requires 3 numbers to open. 2 days later, I found the gate standing open with the lock hanging undone. Not cut, not forced, just opened like someone had known the combination or figured out how the mechanism worked. That's when I started to get genuinely unsettled. The footprints appeared around the same time. I first noticed them after a heavy rain softened the ground around my property. There were impressions in the mud near my back door that I couldn't explain, too large to be human, too human-like to be any animal I knew. Each print was at least 18 inches long and maybe 7 inches wide, with clear toe impressions at one end and a broad heel at the other. They looked almost like human footprints scaled up by a factor of 2 or 3, but with proportions that were subtly wrong, toes that seemed too long, arches that were too flat. I measured one of the clearer prints and photographed it, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a utility worker had been on my property wearing some kind of specialized boots. Maybe the rain had somehow distorted a normal footprint into something that looked larger than it was. Maybe I was just misinterpreting what I was seeing because I was tired and my eyes were playing tricks on me. The explanations I came up with weren't very convincing, but they were better than the alternative. The alternative was that something with feet that size had been walking around my house in the middle of the night, and I wasn't ready to accept that possibility. The sound started a few weeks later, in early September, when the nights were getting longer and the air was beginning to carry that crisp hint of approaching autumn. I was in bed around midnight, just starting to drift off, when I heard footsteps on my back porch. Not the quick scurrying of small animals or the clicking of deer hooves, but heavy, deliberate steps, like a large person walking slowly across the wooden planks. The steps would pause occasionally, as if whatever was making them was stopping to look around or examine something, and then continue. Back and forth across the porch, circling around to the side of the house, then returning to the back again. The pattern continued for maybe 15 minutes while I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear every detail while simultaneously wanting to hear nothing at all. When I finally worked up the courage to grab a flashlight and check outside, there was nothing there. No footprints on the porch, no signs of disturbance, no indication that anything had been walking around my house just moments before. I convinced myself, I'd imagined it, that the sounds had been a dream I'd mistaken for reality in that fuzzy space between sleep and waking. But the sounds came back the next night, and the night after that, and soon they were a regular occurrence, always late at night, always those same slow, heavy footsteps circling my house like something was patrolling the perimeter. The scratching started about a week later. I'd be lying in bed or sitting in my living room watching television, and I'd hear something dragging across the glass of my windows, not random scratching like branches in the wind, but methodical, deliberate sounds like fingernails or claws being drawn slowly across the surface. The scratching would move from window to window, sometimes pausing at each one for several seconds before continuing to the next. I'd follow the sound from inside, tracking it as it made its way around the house. But whenever I'd work up the nerve to look out a window, there was never anything there. Just the darkness of the Vermont night and the distant shapes of trees swaying in the breeze. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed and a hunting knife on my nightstand. I'd never been much for weapons before, preferring to rely on the isolation of my property for security, but now I wanted something to hold onto when the sounds came. The bat and knife wouldn't do much good against a bear or a home invader with a gun, but having them there made me feel slightly less helpless. The final straw came on a cold night in mid-October. I went to bed around 11, checked all the locks like I always did, and fell into a restless sleep punctuated by anxious dreams I couldn't quite remember. When I woke up around 5 in the morning, something felt wrong. The air in the house was different, colder than it should have been, and there was a faint, earthy smell that didn't belong. I got out of bed and walked toward the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. The back door was standing open about 6 inches, letting in the cold autumn air. And on my kitchen floor, leading from the door to the refrigerator and back, were muddy footprints. Those same massive, human-like prints I'd found outside, now tracked into my home. Something had come into my house while I was sleeping, walked to my refrigerator and then left the way it came, leaving the door ajar behind it. I checked the lock on the back door. It was a good lock, a heavy-duty deadbolt that I'd installed myself when I moved. The lock wasn't forced or broken. It had simply been opened, which meant that whatever came in either had a key, which was impossible since I was the only one with a key, or it had somehow figured out how to operate the deadbolt from outside. Neither option was comforting. That day, I drove to the nearest town with a decent hardware store, about 40 minutes away, and bought a complete security camera system. 4 wireless cameras with night vision capability, motion detection, and enough storage to record continuously for weeks. The whole setup cost me close to $1,000, but after finding those prints in my kitchen, I would have paid 10 times that for some answers. I told myself the cameras were about safety. There had been some break-ins reported in the wider area that summer, isolated houses being targeted by someone looking for easy valuables. The local sheriff's department was stretched thin and hadn't made much progress on the cases. A security system seemed like a reasonable precaution for anyone living alone in a remote area. That's what I told myself anyway. Deep down, I knew I was looking for something else. I wanted to see what was leaving those footprints, what was walking around my house at night, what had come into my kitchen while I was sleeping. I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Installing the cameras took most of an afternoon. I mounted one above the front door, covering the driveway and the approach to the house. One went above the back door, angled to capture the porch and the yard beyond. A third covered the side of the house where the garbage enclosure was located, and the fourth I positioned in my kitchen, pointing out the window toward the tree line at the back of my property. The system connected to my home Wi-Fi and linked to an app on my phone that let me monitor all 4 feeds in real time and review recorded footage. I could also set up motion alerts that would notify me whenever any of the cameras detected movement with adjustable sensitivity, so I wouldn't get bombarded with notifications every time a leaf blew past. For the first several days after installing the cameras, nothing happened. No strange sounds, no disturbances to my garbage, no mysterious footprints. The motion alerts would occasionally trigger for deer passing through the yard or raccoons investigating the area near the barn, but nothing unusual. I started to think that maybe the cameras themselves were acting as a deterrent. The blinking red lights that indicated recording status might be enough to scare off whatever had been visiting my property. Maybe it was over. Maybe I'd solved the problem simply by making it clear that any future intrusions would be documented. I should have known better. 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday night, I got my first unexplained motion alert at exactly 2:23 in the morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, waking me from a light sleep. I grabbed it instinctively, expecting to see footage of a deer or maybe a stray cat that had wandered onto my property. When I opened the app and checked the recording from the back door camera, my blood went cold. The footage showed my back porch and yard in that eerie green glow of night vision. For the first few seconds, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then a dark shape moved into frame from the left side, crossing the porch in what looked like 3 or 4 long strides before disappearing off the right edge of the screen. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds, and the shape was too quick and too blurry to make out clearly. But one thing was immediately obvious. Whatever had crossed my porch was big, very big, and it was walking upright on 2 legs. I watched the clip probably 30 times that night, pausing and advancing frame by frame, trying to convince myself I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. The deck railing on my back porch comes up to about my waist, maybe 34 inches off the ground. Whatever crossed the porch in that footage had shoulders that were clearly visible above the railing, even though it seemed to be moving in a slight crouch. That meant it was tall, impossibly tall, and the way it moved wasn't quite human. The stride was too long, the gait was too smooth, like something that was more comfortable moving on 2 legs than any human should be. When dawn finally came, I forced myself to go outside and check the porch. The evidence was waiting for me. Fresh footprints in some mud that had been tracked onto the deck, those same massive barefoot impressions I'd been finding around my property. But these were the clearest prints I'd seen yet, with well-defined toe marks and a heel impression that looked disturbingly human, despite its impossible size. I photographed them from multiple angles, measuring them against my own foot for scale. The largest print was 19 inches from heel to toe. My foot is 8.5 inches. I spent that day trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was someone in a costume, some prankster who'd heard about the break-ins in the area and decided to have some fun at my expense. Maybe the camera angle had distorted things, making a normal-sized person look bigger than they actually were. Maybe the footprints were from some earlier time and I just hadn't noticed them before. The explanations sounded hollow, even as I formed them in my mind. I'd seen the footage, I'd measured the prints. Something that defied easy explanation had walked across my porch in the middle of the night, and no amount of rationalization was going to make that fact go away. Over the following week, the motion alerts became a nightly occurrence. Always between midnight and 4 in the morning, always from the backdoor camera, always showing that same type of footage. A large, dark shape moving too quickly for the camera to capture clearly, sometimes crossing the porch, sometimes visible in the yard nearer the tree line, sometimes appearing to stand near the edge of the frame, as if watching the house. The footprints started showing up everywhere. On the porch, in the flower beds around the foundation, in the soft earth near my vegetable garden, even on the hood of my car one morning, like something had climbed up to get a better vantage point. They were always the same, those massive, human-like impressions with their 2 long toes and 2 wide heels. I started keeping a log of when and where I found them, filling a notebook with dates and locations and measurements, trying to find some pattern that would help me understand what I was dealing with. Food started disappearing from my kitchen around the same time. At first, I thought I was just misremembering what I had. Maybe I'd eaten that package of cold cuts and forgotten about it. Maybe I'd finished the bread yesterday and just didn't recall. But the discrepancies became too consistent to ignore. I'd go to bed with a full package of sliced ham in my refrigerator and wake up to find it gone. An entire loaf of bread would vanish overnight. A bag of apples would disappear from my counter, leaving not even a core behind. The food that went missing was always stuff that could be eaten without preparation. Raw meat, bread, fruit, anything that didn't require cooking. The frozen dinners and canned goods stayed untouched, as if whatever was taking the food either didn't understand how to prepare them or didn't want to take the time. I installed a sliding bolt lock on my kitchen door, feeling ridiculous as I did it. I was locking my kitchen against something inside my own house, barricading one room against an intruder that apparently came and went as it pleased. But I had to do something, had to at least try to stop what was happening. The bolt didn't help. The first morning after I installed it, I woke to find the bolt unlatched and more food missing. Not forced open, not broken, just unlatched, as if whatever came in had simply figured out how the mechanism worked and operated it without difficulty. That's when the full implications of what I was dealing with started to sink in. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct, pushing through barriers because it smelled food on the other side. This was something that could observe a lock, understand how it functioned, and defeat it through intelligence rather than brute force. Something was coming into my house at night, helping itself to my food, and it was smart enough to operate human-made security devices. I decided to stay up and see what happened. I'd been running on inadequate sleep for weeks anyway, so one more night without rest wasn't going to make much difference. I told myself I needed to see it, whatever it was. The footage was convincing but not conclusive. I needed to witness this thing with my own eyes before I could decide what to do next. I set up in my living room with a clear view down the hallway toward the kitchen. I positioned my laptop so I could monitor the security camera feeds while also watching the hallway. If something came in through the back door, I would see it both on camera and in person. The night was quiet until about 1:30 in the morning. I'd been fighting to stay awake, my eyelids heavy despite the tension thrumming through my body, when I heard a sound that snapped me to full alertness. A soft clicking noise coming from the direction of the kitchen, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping their fingernails on a hard surface. The sound continued for maybe half a minute, and then stopped. I checked my phone, but none of the cameras had triggered motion alerts. Whatever was making the sound was somehow staying outside the detection range, or it was already inside and had found a way past the cameras. I heard cabinet doors opening and closing, the sounds unmistakable even from the living room. Then, the distinctive suction sound of a refrigerator door being opened, followed by the hum of the compressor working harder to maintain temperature with the door ajar. Something was in my kitchen, going through my food, exactly as I had suspected had been happening for weeks. I picked up the baseball bat from beside my couch and started moving toward the hallway. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay where I was, to hide, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, and hope whatever was in there would take what it wanted and leave. But I was tired of being afraid in my own home. I was tired of waking up to missing food and muddy footprints and the knowledge that something had been in my space while I was helpless. I needed to see it. I needed to know. I crept down the hallway, placing my feet carefully to minimize noise on the hardwood floor. The sounds from the kitchen continued, cabinet doors opening, the crinkling of food packaging, heavy breathing that was too deep and too slow to be human. There was a smell too, something I'd never encountered before. It was musky and wild, like an animal smell, but mixed with something else, decomposing vegetation, wet earth, a swamp on a hot summer day. The odor grew stronger as I approached the kitchen, coating the back of my throat until I could almost taste it. I stopped at the entrance to the hallway, where it opened into the kitchen, and peered around the corner. What I saw made me forget how to breathe, forget how to think, forget everything except the impossible sight before me. There was something in my kitchen that was not human. It was enormous, at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller, and its entire body was covered in thick hair that looked dark brown or black in the dim light from the refrigerator. The shoulders were massive, probably 3 feet across, tapering to a head that sat on almost no visible neck. The arms were longer than human arms should be, hanging past the knees even when the creature was standing relatively upright. And the hands were huge, with thick fingers that seemed to handle my food containers with surprising delicacy despite their size. I watched, frozen in place, as the creature went through my refrigerator methodically. It would remove an item, bring it close to its face to smell it, and then either eat it immediately or set it aside on the counter. It seemed particularly interested in the deli meats and the bread I'd bought 2 days before, tearing open the packages and consuming the contents in efficient bites. Its movements were deliberate and purposeful, not the random scrabbling of an animal, but the organized search of something with a plan. It knew what it was looking for and where to find it. When it moved around the kitchen, it demonstrated familiarity with the space, going directly to cabinets that contained food and ignoring the ones with dishes or cleaning supplies. The creature's head was the most disturbing part. From my angle, I could see it in profile when it turned to set things on the counter. The skull was larger than a human skull, with a heavy brow ridge that jutted out over deep-set eyes. The face itself was dark, almost leathery-looking, with a nose that was flatter and wider than human norms. When it opened its mouth to eat, I glimpsed teeth that were definitely not human, larger and more prominent than they should have been. But the eyes were what stayed with me. Even in profile, I could see intelligence there, awareness, understanding. This wasn't some primitive beast operating on instinct. It was thinking, evaluating, making decisions based on criteria I couldn't fathom. I stood there watching for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Part of my brain was insisting this couldn't be real, that I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination or vivid nightmare. But I could smell the creature's musk, hear its breathing, see every detail of its massive form as it moved through my kitchen. This was real. This was happening. Then the creature stopped what it was doing and went completely still. Its head turned slightly in my direction, and I realized with a surge of terror that it had sensed me watching. Slowly, very slowly, the creature straightened to its full height. Its head was so close to my 8-foot ceiling that it almost touched. It turned more fully toward the hallway where I was standing, and for the first time, I saw its eyes clearly. They reflected the light from the refrigerator like an animal's eyes, but the intelligence behind them was unmistakable. It knew I was there. It knew I had been watching it. We stared at each other across my kitchen for what felt like forever. I couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't do anything except stand there with my useless baseball bat and wait for whatever was going to happen next. The creature tilted its head slightly, regarding me with what looked almost like curiosity rather than aggression. It made no move to approach me, showed no signs of hostile intent. It just watched me with those intelligent eyes, as if trying to figure out what I would do. Then I heard sounds from outside, deep vocalizations coming from the woods behind my house. Not howls or roars exactly, but something in between, carrying clear intentionality like calls or signals being passed between individuals. The creature in my kitchen immediately responded to these sounds, turning away from me and starting toward the back door. But instead of just rushing out, it began doing something that chilled me more than its size or its eyes had. It started cleaning up. It wiped down the counter where it had set food, using its massive hand to brush away crumbs and moisture. It closed cabinet doors it had opened, pushing them shut with those thick fingers. It even picked up some food packaging from the floor and placed it in my trash can. This thing was deliberately minimizing evidence of its presence. It understood that it was in a human space, and it was taking steps to conceal its intrusion. The level of intelligence that demonstrated was more frightening than any physical threat could have been. I watched as the creature moved toward my back door with an odd, shuffling gait, like its legs weren't quite built for upright walking, even though it was clearly comfortable on 2 feet. When it reached the door, I expected it to force its way out, maybe break the lock or tear the door off its hinges. Instead, it examined the deadbolt for a moment, then carefully unlocked and opened the door like it had done this 100 times before. The creature paused in the doorway and looked back at me across the kitchen. Our eyes met one more time, and I saw something in its expression that I still can't fully describe, not threat or malice, but acknowledgement, recognition, like it was noting my presence and filing that information away for future reference. Then it stepped out onto my porch and gently closed the door behind it. I ran to the kitchen window and watched as the creature crossed my yard in long, smooth strides. It moved incredibly fast for something so large, covering ground at a pace that no human could match. Within seconds, it had reached the tree line and disappeared into the forest without making a sound. If I hadn't watched it go, I would never have believed something that size could move through dense woodland so quietly. The vocalizations from the woods continued for several more minutes, and I heard what sounded like responses from multiple directions. There wasn't just one of these things. There were several of them out there, communicating with each other in the darkness beyond my property. I stood at my kitchen window for over an hour, watching the tree line and listening to the occasional calls echo through the night. Gradually, the sounds faded, and the normal nighttime chorus of insects and small animals returned. Whatever had been out there was gone. At least, for now. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I couldn't even bring myself to go back into the kitchen until sunlight was streaming through the windows. When I finally examined the scene in daylight, the evidence was undeniable. Massive, muddy footprints tracked from the back door to the refrigerator and around the counter area. Several packages of food were missing entirely. What remained had been arranged more neatly than I ever kept things, as if the creature had been trying to organize what it wasn't taking. The musky smell lingered for hours, even after I opened all the windows, clinging to surfaces and fabrics in a way that normal odors don't. But the most unsettling part was how little damage there was. The creature could clearly have destroyed anything in my kitchen if it wanted to. Instead, it had moved through the space with remarkable care, avoiding breakable items, closing doors properly, even disposing of its garbage. This wasn't mindless animal behavior. This was deliberate, intelligent action from something that understood it was in a human environment and chose to respect that environment's organization. The security footage confirmed everything I'd witnessed. The back door camera had captured the creature entering my house at 1:47 in the morning, showing it examining the door for several seconds before operating the deadbolt and letting itself in. The kitchen camera gave me a clear view of its time inside, recording every moment of its methodical food search from an angle above and to the side. Watching the footage was somehow more disturbing than seeing the creature in person had been. The camera captured details I'd missed in my terrified observation. The way it would occasionally pause and look around, checking to make sure it wasn't being watched before continuing its search. The almost gentle way it handled items, never crushing or dropping anything, despite its enormous hands. The clear decision-making process, visible in its movements as it evaluated different foods and chose what to take. The intelligence displayed in every frame was undeniable and deeply unsettling. But the most chilling part of the footage came after the creature left. For almost 15 minutes after it disappeared into the woods, I could see shapes moving at the edge of the camera's range. Indistinct figures that seemed to be watching my house from the safety of the tree line, observing from the darkness. I wasn't dealing with a single creature. There was a group of them, and they were studying my property. The days following that encounter blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, confusion, and fear. I must have watched the security footage hundreds of times, analyzing every frame, looking for something that would let me dismiss what I'd seen as a hoax or a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a person in an elaborate costume. Maybe some technical glitch in the camera was distorting the images. Maybe I'd had some kind of psychotic break and imagined the whole thing. But no matter how many times I reviewed the evidence, the conclusion remained the same. Something impossible had been in my house, something that wasn't human, but was intelligent enough to operate locks, minimize evidence of its presence, and communicate with others of its kind. I thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That Bigfoot had been raiding my refrigerator, They'd think I was crazy or playing some kind of elaborate joke. Even with video evidence, the most likely response would be skepticism and dismissal. The footage could be faked. The footprints could be manufactured. My story could be attention-seeking or delusion. I thought about contacting researchers or investigators who specialized in cryptid phenomena, but the idea of inviting strangers to my property, people who might bring media attention or turn my life into some kind of circus, was almost as frightening as the creature itself. I wasn't ready to become a footnote in the Bigfoot believer community, cited by true believers and mocked by skeptics for the rest of my life. Instead, I focused on trying to understand what I was dealing with and how to protect myself. I researched everything I could find about similar encounters, spending hours reading through accounts from people who claimed to have experienced something like what I'd witnessed. What I found was simultaneously reassuring and disturbing. There were hundreds of similar stories from all over North America, many describing creatures that matched what I'd seen almost exactly. Large, hair-covered humanoids displaying intelligence and tool use, sometimes appearing around isolated houses near forested areas. Most accounts describe the creatures as generally non-aggressive toward humans, more curious than hostile. They seemed drawn to easy food sources and were often reported going through garbage, investigating gardens, or entering buildings when no one was home. But they typically avoided direct confrontation and would retreat if discovered. This matched my experience almost perfectly. The creature in my kitchen hadn't threatened me or shown any aggressive behavior. If anything, it had seemed more interested in avoiding conflict than causing it. That recognition in its eyes when it looked back at me from the doorway, it wasn't the calculating stare of a predator evaluating prey. It was something else, acknowledgement, maybe even respect for my status as another intelligent being. Understanding that made me feel slightly less terrified. But knowing these things weren't likely to attack me didn't make me feel safe either. 5 days after my first close encounter, they came back. I'd been sleeping poorly, starting at every small sound, checking my cameras compulsively throughout the night. I'd installed additional motion-activated lights around the property and started keeping all my food in sealed containers that were harder to open than standard packaging. The security system was on maximum sensitivity, set to alert me at even the slightest movement near the house. The alert started coming in around 11:30, earlier than usual. First the back door camera, then the side yard, then the kitchen window camera watching the woods. Multiple shapes were moving around my property, and they weren't bothering to stay hidden this time. I watched the live feeds from my phone, heart pounding, as 3 distinct figures moved around my house. They were similar in size and build to the creature I'd seen in my kitchen, but their behavior was completely different. Instead of one individual carefully entering my house to search for food, these 3 seemed to be working together to examine my property from multiple angles, like a team conducting a survey or assessment. One stayed near the back door, examining the lock and the new motion lights I'd installed. It spent several minutes testing the light sensor, moving in and out of its range to see how quickly it triggered. Another circled the side of the house, staying just at the edge of the camera coverage, but clearly visible as a large, upright figure. The third remained near the tree line, apparently acting as a lookout, its head turning periodically to scan the surrounding woods. The one at my back door seemed frustrated by the changes I'd made. It examined the new deadbolt I'd installed, running its thick fingers over the mechanism, testing the door handle repeatedly. When the motion lights kept flicking on and revealing its position, it backed off and tried approaching from different angles, learning the coverage pattern of the sensors. Eventually, it gave up on the door and moved to one of my kitchen windows. I watched in horrified fascination as it tested the window, not trying to break the glass but checking to see if it was locked, examining the frame for potential entry points. The creature was learning, adapting, looking for alternative ways to access my house now that I'd changed the security on the obvious routes. After about 25 minutes of this systematic examination, all three figures retreated back into the woods. But I could see periodic movement in the tree line for the rest of the night, dark shapes passing back and forth, occasionally pausing to watch the house. They were still out there, still observing. The next morning brought fresh evidence of their presence. Footprints everywhere, on the deck, near every ground floor window, around the garbage enclosure, even on the hood of my car, where something had apparently climbed up to get a better vantage point. But they had also left something else, something that made my blood run cold in a different way. Near my back door, I found a small pile of stones, arranged in a deliberate stack. 7 smooth river rocks, balanced carefully on top of each other like a tiny cairn, the kind hikers sometimes build to mark trails. The arrangement was too precise to be accidental. These creatures had left me a message. I had no idea what that message meant, but its intentionality was undeniable. They weren't just searching for food anymore. They were communicating. Over the following week, the encounters became more frequent and more bold. Not every night, but often enough that I was constantly on edge, never knowing when the next motion alert would come or what the cameras would show. The creatures seemed to be testing my defenses systematically, probing different areas each time, looking for changes I'd made and working around whatever obstacles I put in their way. When I installed security film on my ground floor windows to make them harder to break, they shifted their attention to the second floor. When I added cameras to cover the new angles, they started approaching from directions that avoided the detection fields. It was like playing chess against an opponent who was always several moves ahead, who learned faster than I could adapt and treated every countermeasure as a puzzle to be solved rather than a barrier to be respected. Food started disappearing from my house again, despite my improved security. I'd wake up to find containers opened, packages emptied, sometimes with the contents partially consumed, and the rest left neatly arranged on my counter. The creatures were getting in somehow, finding access points I couldn't identify or defeating locks I thought were secure. I installed motion sensors inside the house, and they stopped triggering alerts, as if the creatures had learned the coverage patterns and found ways to move through my home without setting them off. The psychological pressure was exhausting. I barely slept, constantly checking my cameras and listening for sounds. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't relax, couldn't feel safe in my own home. Every shadow outside my windows looked like a potential threat. Every normal house sound made me reach for the baseball bat that now accompanied me everywhere. But the worst part was the growing realization that this wasn't going to stop. These creatures had identified my property as a resource, and they were too intelligent to be deterred by the kinds of measures that would stop ordinary wildlife. What bothered me most about these encounters wasn't the creatures' size or strength, though both were formidable. It was their obvious intelligence. These weren't simple animals operating on instinct, approaching the same problem the same way over and over until they either succeeded or gave up. They were problem solvers, capable of learning and adapting their behavior based on new information. The rock cairn had been just the beginning. Over the following days, I found other signs of deliberate communication or marking around my property. Sticks arranged in geometric patterns near the boundary between my yard and the forest. Scratches on trees that formed recognizable symbols. Circles and triangles and lines that were too regular to be natural damage. Small objects from my property moved to specific locations, like they were being used to send messages I couldn't understand. The creatures seemed to know when I was home versus when I was away. The motion alerts would come when I went to town for groceries or drove to a coffee shop to try to get some work done, but the property would be quiet when I was inside. Somehow, they could tell the difference between an occupied and unoccupied house. Maybe they watched for my car, or listened for sounds of activity, or had some other way of monitoring my presence that I couldn't fathom. They also demonstrated clear understanding of my security system. After the first few encounters, they started moving in ways that minimized camera exposure, approaching from blind spots and staying just outside the motion detection range. They learned the coverage patterns faster than most humans would have. This level of intelligence was more disturbing than any physical threat. It suggested these creatures weren't just random animals looking for food, but thinking beings with their own agenda and communication system. They were studying me as much as I was trying to study them, and unlike me, they seemed to have the upper hand. I started seriously considering abandoning my home, giving up the property I'd loved for 8 years and starting over somewhere else. But I had no guarantee this wouldn't happen again wherever I went. And the idea of running away, of admitting defeat to creatures that weren't even supposed to exist, felt wrong somehow. This was my home. I'd built my life here. Why should I be the one who had to leave? Last week, everything came to a head in a way I never could have anticipated. I'd been staying with a friend in town for a few days, trying to get some decent sleep and figure out my next move. The constant vigilance had worn me down to the point where I couldn't function anymore. I needed a break, even if just for a night or two, somewhere I could close my eyes without wondering what might be standing outside my window. When I came home on Wednesday evening, I immediately sensed something was different. The house felt different, smelled different. Not the strong, musky odor I associated with the creatures, but something subtler, a faint trace of their presence that lingered in the air. Small things were out of place in ways I couldn't quite identify at first. Food packaging in my recycling that I didn't remember throwing away. Chairs moved slightly from where I'd left them. My thermostat set to a different temperature than I usually kept it. Someone or something had been spending time in my house while I was gone. That night, I decided to wait and see what would happen. I turned off all the lights and positioned myself in my bedroom with a clear view of the hallway and the kitchen beyond. If something came in, I would see it. I don't know what I planned to do if that happened. Confront the creatures, document their behavior, just watch and try to understand. Maybe I just needed to see them again to confirm that what I remembered was real and not some elaborate delusion born of stress and isolation. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the back door open. Not the sound of forced entry or breaking locks, just the quiet click of the latch and the whisper of the door swinging on its hinges. Footsteps moved through my kitchen, heavy but careful, like something trying not to wake a sleeping household. Then something new happened. Instead of just going to the food and eating, the footsteps moved through the rest of my house. I heard them in my living room, then in the hallway, then getting closer to my bedroom. The creature was searching for something, and I was terribly afraid it was searching for me. My bedroom door was partially open, and I could see a shadow moving in the hallway, much taller and broader than any human shadow should be. It paused outside my door for what felt like forever, and I was absolutely certain it knew I was there. I could smell that musky odor, stronger now than ever before, and I could hear breathing that was too deep and too slow to be human. Then it made a sound. Not a growl or a roar, but a low, rumbling vocalization that had the cadence and inflection of speech. It was trying to communicate something, and that something was clearly directed at me. The sound was unlike anything a human throat could produce, deep and resonant, almost feeling more than hearing it. But there was obvious meaning and intention behind the noise. It was speaking to me in whatever language its kind used, trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I didn't respond. I couldn't respond. I just lay there frozen, trying not to breathe too loudly, hoping it would lose interest and leave. After several more of these vocalizations, each with slightly different tones and patterns, like it was trying different approaches to communication, the creature moved away from my bedroom and back toward the kitchen. I heard the back door open and close, and then silence. When I finally worked up the courage to check my security cameras, I found footage that changed everything I thought I understood about these encounters. The recordings showed not one creature, but four of them. They had entered my house together, and while one was making those sounds outside my bedroom, the others were systematically going through my belongings, not destroying or stealing, but examining, like investigators at a crime scene or anthropologists studying artifacts from an unfamiliar culture. They looked through my books, turning pages with those massive but surprisingly dexterous fingers. They examined my computer, studying the screen and keyboard with obvious interest. They went through my closet, handling my clothes, smelling them, holding them up as if checking the size. They seemed particularly fascinated by photographs, spending considerable time studying pictures of me and my family, passing them between each other and pointing at different elements in the images. They examined tools and household objects with clear curiosity, picking things up, manipulating them, putting them back where they found them with remarkable precision. This wasn't a food raid. This was reconnaissance. They were learning about me, studying my life and habits with the thoroughness of researchers conducting a field study. The realization was terrifying in a way that simple breaking and entering never could have been. That was 8 days ago, and I haven't had any encounters since. No motion alerts in the middle of the night, no sounds of footsteps on my porch, no signs of their presence around my property. The sudden silence is almost more unnerving than the regular visits had been. I keep checking my cameras, watching for movement in the tree line, waiting for them to return. But everything has been quiet. Either they got whatever information they were looking for, or they're planning something that requires them to lay low for a while. Neither possibility gives me much comfort. I've made the decision to sell my house and move somewhere with more neighbors, less wilderness. I can't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder and wondering when they'll be back. Whatever these creatures are, they've claimed this area as their territory, and I'm not equipped to share it with them. The hardest part is knowing that I'll probably never get answers to the questions that keep me up at night. What did they want from my house specifically? Why did they choose my property out of all the isolated homes in this area? What were they trying to communicate during that last encounter? How many of them are out there? And how long have they been watching human settlements from the edges of our civilization? I've thought about going public with my story and the video evidence. There's a researcher at a university a few states away who specializes in unexplained primate sightings, and I've drafted several emails to her that I've never had the courage to send. I've considered uploading my footage to the internet and letting people draw their own conclusions. I've imagined telling my story on podcasts or news shows, becoming the person who finally provided undeniable proof that these creatures exist. But I'm not ready for the scrutiny and disbelief that would come with going public. I'm not ready to have my mental stability questioned, my motivations examined, my entire life turned upside down by attention I never wanted. Maybe someday, when I'm living somewhere safe and can think about this objectively, I'll share what I have with people who might be able to make sense of it. For now, I just want to get as far away from here as possible and try to rebuild some sense of normalcy in my life. But I know I'll never look at a dark forest the same way again, and I'll never be completely convinced that we're alone on this planet, that we're the only intelligent beings walking around on two legs, making decisions, solving problems, forming communities. These creatures have been out there for who knows how long, watching us from the shadows, learning our habits, adapting to our presence in ways we never noticed. They know about our houses and our security systems and our food storage. They know what we look like, how we live, maybe even what we're capable of. And they've managed to keep their existence hidden from mainstream science and society for all of recorded history. If you live in a rural area, especially somewhere that borders wilderness or forest land, pay attention to small signs that something might be watching, missing food with no obvious explanation, disturbed garbage that doesn't look like typical animal activity, unexplained footprints, especially large ones with human-like shapes, strange sounds at night that don't match any local wildlife, tools or objects moved from where you left them. These might not be random occurrences. And if you ever decide to install security cameras around your property, be prepared for the possibility that you might capture something you never expected to see. Sometimes the things we assume are myths and legends are just very good at staying hidden. I never believed in Bigfoot 5 weeks ago. I thought the whole concept was ridiculous, a cultural phenomenon built on mice-identified bears and elaborate hoaxes. Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore. But I know what I've seen, I know what my cameras recorded, and I know these creatures are out there, watching and learning and adapting to our world in ways we don't understand. The security footage I have is stored in multiple locations now, backed up to cloud services and copied to external drives that I keep in different places. Partly that's for safety, in case something happens to my computer or my property, but partly it's because I want there to be a record, proof that this happened even if something happens to me. I've written down everything I can remember about each encounter, documenting dates and times and details while they're still fresh in my mind. I've photographed every footprint, every rock cairn, every bit of physical evidence that the creatures left behind. If I ever decide to share this publicly, I want to have everything organized and documented so people can evaluate it for themselves. The woman who used to live in my house before me, the one I bought the property from 8 years ago, she mentioned something during the sale that I dismissed at the time. She said she'd seen strange things in the woods sometimes, shapes that moved wrong, sounds that didn't belong. She said the property had history, that people in the area told stories about these woods going back generations. I nodded politely and changed the subject, assuming she was eccentric or trying to add mystique to the property to justify the price. Now I wonder what else she knew. Now I wonder if she sold this place because she couldn't handle living here anymore, because she'd seen what I've seen and decided it was time to leave. Maybe I should have listened more carefully. Maybe I should have asked more questions. But would I have believed her? Probably not. I didn't believe in any of this until I saw it with my own eyes. That's the thing about skepticism. It's comfortable and rational and it protects you from believing nonsense. But sometimes the nonsense is real, and skepticism just leaves you unprepared when the impossible walks into your kitchen and helps itself to your lunch meat. I'm writing this at 2 in the morning, sitting in my living room with all the lights on and my phone showing live feeds from all 4 cameras. Nothing is moving outside except the trees swaying in the breeze. The forest is quiet. The creatures, wherever they are, seem to be leaving me alone tonight. Maybe they've decided I'm not worth the trouble. Maybe they've moved on to someone else's property, some other isolated house where the resident doesn't have cameras or suspicions or a growing file of evidence. Or maybe they're just watching from farther away, content to observe for now, patient in a way that makes human timescales irrelevant. I'll never know what they're thinking or planning. I'll never understand what they wanted from me or why they chose my property for their nocturnal visits. All I know is that they're real, they're intelligent, and they're far more numerous and organized than I ever could have imagined. If you're reading this and you've had similar experiences, you're not crazy. You're not alone. There are others like us, people who've seen things that don't fit into neat categories, things that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. Find communities of others who've experienced these encounters. Document everything you can. Don't let anyone tell you that what you saw wasn't real just because it shouldn't exist. Trust your eyes. Trust your cameras. Trust the evidence, even when it contradicts everything you thought you knew about the world. And if you haven't had these experiences yet, if you're reading this as a skeptic who thinks I'm making things up or misinterpreting normal events, I understand. I was you 5 weeks ago. I thought all of this was nonsense for 37 years. The only thing I can tell you is to keep an open mind. Pay attention to the small things that don't quite add up, the little mysteries you usually dismiss as coincidence or forgetfulness. You might be surprised by what you find when you start looking carefully. The world is stranger than we want to believe, and sometimes, if you watch long enough, the strangeness looks back. I'm selling my house. I'm moving somewhere with streetlights and neighbors and no forest within walking distance. I'm going to try to forget what I've seen and build a normal life somewhere safe, but I know that's probably impossible. These encounters have changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I flinch at sounds I never would have noticed before. I scan tree lines automatically, looking for shapes that don't belong. I dream about massive figures standing outside my windows, watching me with intelligent eyes that reflect the light like an animal's, but show something far more unsettling than animal instincts. Those eyes haunt me more than anything else about these encounters. The size of the creatures was shocking, their intelligence was disturbing, their ability to adapt and learn was frightening. But it's the eyes I see when I close my own, that moment of recognition in my kitchen when it realized I was watching. That pause at my bedroom door when it vocalized something I couldn't understand. The acknowledgement in its gaze when it looked back at me before leaving, filing away my existence for future reference. These creatures know about us. They've probably always known about us. And now I know about them. Whatever that means, whatever consequences come from this mutual awareness, I'll have to find a way to live with them. Because there's no going back to the comfortable skepticism I used to enjoy. There's no unseeing what I've seen. The world has creatures in it that shouldn't exist, but absolutely do. They live in the wild places, watching from the darkness, studying us with intelligence we can barely comprehend. And sometimes, when conditions are right or circumstances align in ways we don't understand, they decide to get closer. I got closer than I ever wanted. I learned things I never wanted to know. And now I'm leaving, running away from a home I loved, because staying means accepting that I share this territory with something ancient and intelligent and utterly unknown. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe I should stay and study them, document their behavior, try to understand what they are and what they want. But I'm not a scientist. I'm not an adventurer. I'm just a woman who wanted to live quietly in a beautiful place, and instead found herself caught up in something beyond her comprehension. This is my story. Take it however you want. Believe it or dismiss it. I've stopped trying to convince skeptics because I know how I would have reacted to this story before I lived it. All I can do is tell the truth as I experienced it and hope that someone, somewhere, might benefit from knowing what I know now. The creatures are real. They're out there. And if you live near wild places, they might already know about you. Be careful. Watch the tree line. And if you start noticing small things that don't add up, food that goes missing, objects that move on their own, footprints that seem impossibly large, don't dismiss them. Don't assume there's a rational explanation for everything. Sometimes the irrational explanation is the right one. Sometimes the monsters are real. I wish I'd known that 5 weeks ago. I wish someone had warned me about what was out there in those woods. Maybe I could have prepared better. Maybe I could have protected myself. Maybe I wouldn't be packing up my life and running away from the place I thought I'd grow old in. But I didn't know. And now I do. And all I can do with that knowledge is share it and hope it helps someone else who might be facing the same thing. This is my warning. This is my testimony. Make of it what you will. The creatures are watching. They've always been watching, and sometimes they come inside. There are moments now when I question my own sanity, when I wonder if the stress of isolation and the pressure of working alone finally broke something in my mind. Those moments usually come in the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the sunlight is streaming through my windows and the forest looks peaceful and ordinary, just trees and underbrush and the occasional deer wandering through the yard. In those moments, I can almost convince myself that none of it really happened, that I've been suffering from some kind of elaborate delusion brought on by too much solitude and not enough human contact. Then I pull out my phone and watch the security footage again, and the doubt evaporates like morning mist. The creatures are there, captured in digital clarity, moving through my kitchen and around my property with their massive frames and their intelligent eyes. No delusion could manufacture that footage. No mental breakdown could create physical evidence like the footprints I photographed and measured, the rock cairns I documented, the scratch marks on the trees that form symbols I don't understand. I've started keeping a journal of every encounter, every piece of evidence, every strange occurrence that might be connected to the creatures. The journal has grown thick over the past weeks, filled with observations and theories and questions I can't answer. I've mapped the footprint locations on a diagram of my property, trying to identify patterns in their movements. I've analyzed the timing of the motion alerts, looking for correlations with weather patterns or lunar cycles or anything else that might explain when they choose to visit. I've even tried to document the vocalizations I've heard, writing down phonetic approximations of the sounds and noting their context and timing. None of this analysis has given me any real answers. The patterns I think I see might just be coincidence or confirmation bias. The creatures seem to operate according to rules I can't understand, logic that doesn't map onto human behavior or animal instinct in any way I can recognize. But the documentation feels important somehow, like I'm creating a record that might someday help someone understand what these beings are and how they live. Or maybe it's just a way to feel like I have some control over a situation, where I'm clearly outmatched in every conceivable way. The local library has become an unexpected resource. The town is too small to have much of a collection, but the librarian, an elderly man named Harold, who's been running the place for 40 years, has access to archives that go back to the founding of the settlement. When I asked if there were any historical accounts of strange occurrences in the area, he gave me a look that suggested he knew more than he was saying. Then he led me to a back room filled with boxes of documents that had never been properly catalogued. Town records and personal papers and newspaper clippings going back to the 1800s. I spent 3 full days going through those boxes, and what I found confirmed my worst suspicions. There have been sightings in this area for as long as anyone can remember. Newspaper articles from the 1890s describe wild men seen in the mountains by logging crews and hunters. Personal diaries from early settlers mention encounters with hairy giants that watched from the forest edges. Town meeting minutes from the 1920s include discussions about the forest things and debates about whether hunting parties should be organized to drive them away. The accounts span more than a century and come from dozens of different sources, people with no connection to each other describing the same basic phenomenon. Large, hair-covered humanoids living in the wilderness, intelligent enough to avoid human contact most of the time, but occasionally revealing themselves to isolated individuals. Harold noticed my interest in these materials and eventually shared his own experience. When he was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, he'd gone camping alone in the mountains about 15 miles from where my property sits now. One night, something came into his camp while he was sleeping and went through his supplies, eating his food and examining his equipment with obvious curiosity. He woke up just in time to see a massive figure disappearing into the tree line, walking upright on 2 legs, its body covered in dark hair. He never told anyone about the encounter because he knew no one would believe him. But he's been collecting information about similar sightings ever since, filing away every account he comes across, building a private archive of evidence that this region has inhabitants that no one wants to acknowledge. He told me the creatures have been here longer than the town has existed, longer than Europeans have been on this continent, maybe longer than humans have walked these forests. They were here first, and in some ways, we're the intruders. That conversation with Harold changed how I think about my encounters. I'd been approaching this as if I were the victim, as if these creatures had invaded my space and violated my home. But from their perspective, maybe I was the one who'd encroached on territory that belonged to them long before any human built a house here. My property sits at the edge of thousands of acres of protected wilderness, land that hasn't been developed or logged in decades, that might harbor a population of these beings that's been living undisturbed for generations. When I moved in 8 years ago, I wasn't just buying a house. I was setting up residence at the boundary between human civilization and something much older, something that operates by rules we don't understand and doesn't recognize our legal concepts of property ownership. That doesn't make the encounters less frightening, but it does make me think about them differently. The creatures aren't monsters invading human spaces. They're residents of a territory that humans have gradually encroached upon, adapting to our presence, learning about our technology and our habits, trying to understand the strange beings who keep building structures at the edges of their domain. The food raids, the examinations of my property, the reconnaissance mission where they went through my belongings, maybe all of that was research. Maybe they were trying to understand who I am and what I'm doing here, the same way I've been trying to understand them. That thought should be comforting, I suppose. It suggests the creatures are motivated by curiosity rather than hostility, that they're studying us the way scientists might study a newly discovered species. But somehow the idea of being studied by something I can't understand is almost as disturbing as the idea of being hunted by it. At least prey knows what the predator wants. I have no idea what these creatures want from me, what information they're gathering, what conclusions they're drawing, or what they plan to do with whatever they've learned. My therapist, a woman I've been seeing over video calls since I moved out here, thinks I'm experiencing some kind of stress-related breakdown. I've told her a sanitized version of what's been happening, leaving out the details that would make her think I'm completely unhinged. I talked about feeling watched, about strange sounds at night, about anxiety that makes it hard to sleep. She prescribed medication and recommended I spend more time around other people, perhaps consider whether rural isolation is really healthy for me. She's not wrong about the isolation being a problem, but the medication doesn't make the creatures go away. And spending time in town doesn't erase the footage I have on my phone. I've stopped telling her about the encounters because there's no point. She can't help me with something she doesn't believe exists. She can only help me cope with my reaction to it, which I suppose is valuable in its own way. The coping strategies she's taught me, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, ways to manage acute anxiety, have gotten me through some of the worst nights. But they don't change the fundamental reality of my situation. I've started carrying a camera with me everywhere, a small digital camera that fits in my pocket and can be ready to shoot in seconds. If I see one of the creatures again, if one appears during daylight hours when I might have a chance at a clear image, I want to be ready. The security footage is compelling, but it's all night vision. That eerie green glow that makes everything look slightly unreal. A clear daylight photograph, something that shows the creature in full detail with recognizable surroundings for scale. That would be different. That might be enough to convince people who won't believe grainy night video. Of course, the creatures seem to know about cameras now. They've learned to avoid my security system, moving in ways that minimize their exposure to the sensors. Why would they be any less careful about being photographed during the day? They've managed to stay hidden from mainstream documentation for thousands of years. A lone woman with a pocket camera isn't likely to change that. There's a man in town who's become an unlikely ally in all this. His name is Robert, and he runs the small diner that serves as the social hub for the area. When I first started coming in with dark circles under my eyes and a haunted look on my face, he assumed I was dealing with the usual stresses of remote living, loneliness, seasonal depression, the challenges of working from home with no clear separation between professional and personal life. But after a few weeks of watching me jump at sudden sounds and compulsively check my phone, he asked if there was something else going on. I told him a version of the truth. Not the whole story, but enough to suggest I'd been experiencing things I couldn't explain. To my surprise, he didn't laugh or suggest I see a psychiatrist. He just nodded slowly and said, "They've been active lately, more than usual." It turned out Robert has his own history with the creatures. He grew up in this area, and his grandfather used to tell stories about the forest people who lived in the mountains. Robert had encounters of his own as a younger man, glimpses and sounds and physical evidence that he's never shared with anyone outside his immediate family. He's spent decades quietly paying attention to the local reports, tracking the cycles of activity, noting when the creatures seem more bold or more reclusive. According to him, they tend to be more active in years when the berry crop is poor, or the winter was particularly harsh, when they need to range farther for food and are more willing to approach human settlements. This year apparently fits that pattern. Robert has become a source of practical advice. He's the one who suggested I reinforce my doors with additional deadbolts, the heavy-duty kind that are harder to manipulate from outside. He's the one who told me about motion-activated sprinkler systems that some people use to deter wildlife, though he wasn't sure they'd work on creatures intelligent enough to figure out cameras. He's the one who shared the local wisdom about not leaving food unsecured and not establishing patterns that the creatures might learn to predict. None of his advice has stopped the encounters completely, but I think it's made a difference. The creatures still visit my property, but they seem more cautious now, more aware that I'm taking countermeasures. Robert also told me something that stuck with me. He said the creatures have been here since before humans came to this continent, and they'll still be here after we're gone. They're not invaders or pests to be eliminated. They're part of the ecosystem, as native to these mountains as the bears and the moose and the ancient trees. In his view, the best approach isn't to fight them or try to drive them away, but to find a way to coexist, to establish boundaries that both sides can respect. He makes it sound so reasonable, like we're talking about a neighbor with different habits rather than cryptid creatures that break into houses and study human belongings with alien intelligence. But maybe he's right. Maybe coexistence is possible if I can just figure out how to communicate my boundaries in ways they understand. The rock cairn they left at my door was clearly an attempt at communication. Maybe I should try to respond somehow, to establish a dialogue that doesn't require spoken language. But that's not a project I'm going to undertake. I've made my decision. I'm selling the house and leaving this area for good. Whatever relationship might be possible between humans and these creatures, I'm not equipped to explore it. I don't have the courage, the expertise, or the psychological resilience to be a pioneer in interspecies diplomacy. I just want to live somewhere I can sleep through the night without wondering what's walking around outside my window. The house has been listed for 2 weeks. There's been some interest, mostly from people who are drawn to the isolation and natural beauty the way I was 8 years ago. I find myself wanting to warn them, to tell them what they might be getting into by buying property at the edge of this wilderness. But what would I say? That the area has Bigfoot, that they should be prepared for nocturnal visits from intelligent cryptids. They'd think I was trying to tank the sale, or that I was mentally unstable and the property should be avoided for that reason alone. So I stay quiet. I show the house to prospective buyers and answer their questions about square footage and property taxes and internet connectivity. I don't mention the security cameras I'm leaving installed, positioned to capture footage of anything unusual that might happen after I'm gone. I don't mention the journal I've kept, or the evidence I've collected, or the encounters that drove me to this decision. If the new owners experience what I've experienced, they'll have the cameras to document it. Maybe they'll be braver than me. Maybe they'll find a way to understand these creatures that I never could. Or maybe the creatures will leave them alone, and my whole experience will fade into local legend. Another story about strange things in the woods that no one really believes. Either way, I'll be somewhere else, trying to rebuild a life that doesn't involve checking security feeds at 3 in the morning and jumping at every shadow outside my window. I've learned things I never wanted to know. I've seen evidence of beings that aren't supposed to exist. I've felt the weight of intelligence behind eyes that reflect light like an animal's, but show understanding far beyond any animal I've encountered. Whatever that knowledge costs me in the long run, whatever adjustments I have to make to my worldview and my sense of safety, it's better to deal with those costs somewhere that doesn't have creatures standing outside my bedroom door, trying to communicate in a language I can't understand. This is my story. This is my warning. The world is stranger than most people want to believe. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough or curious enough to look in the right places, the strangeness reveals itself in ways that can't be ignored. I looked, I saw, and now I'm leaving. Because some revelations are too heavy to carry in the places where they occurred. The creatures are out there. They've always been out there. And now that I know that, nothing will ever feel quite the same again. Watch the tree line. Pay attention to the small things that don't add up. And if you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, remember that you might not be as alone as you think. They're watching. They're always watching. And sometimes when you least expect it, they come inside.